and I'm also the creator behind the YouTube channel 87walker. I've been running the channel for a few years now, and it is dedicated exclusively to cacti and succulents, although it's predominantly cactus. So I have over 100 videos. So if you're looking for something to do while you're waiting for spring to come around, hopefully there's enough there to keep you entertained for a little while. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook as well. So tonight we'll be talking about seedling grafting to Pereskiopsis. It's a topic that I am very, very passionate about. I get very excited about it. Now I will tell you that I don't believe that there's any secrets, so I'm not going to tell you to sprinkle goji berries around your grafts and they'll be fantastic. It's a combination of factors. And the method that I'll go through tonight is one that I've been working on and refining for a few years now. So probably the first question that might come to mind is the one that I tend to overlook, and I have done so in all of my videos, is, well, why would you graft something? The number one reason that you would graft is to increase the speed that the scion, which is the grafted portion, increase the speed that it grows at. So the growth would be drastically amplified by grafting. So up on screen at the moment is an example. They're both Astrophyta mysterias. The one on the left is seed grown, it's about 4 years old. The one on the right is not even a year. So that gives you an indication of what you can achieve by grafting, specifically with Pereskiopsis. The other reason that you might graft is for plants that can't be grown on their own roots, so for ones that don't produce chlorophyll, so albinos. And the one that you're probably most familiar with is the moon cactus. You'll have seen them in Bunnings. They're the Gymnocalycium. They come in bright yellow, red, and even that mutant pink, which is an acquired taste. So they're probably the common ones that you're going to see. And then the other types, sort of same within that sort of bracket of plants that are heavily variegated. So depending on the level of variegation will determine just how strong that plant's going to be. The more variegation, the weaker it's going to be. So you can pick out a seedling early on, graft it, and you'll have a much better time and much better luck with it than growing on its own roots. These are some of my grafts from last season just gone. So I ended up on 600, around 600 successful. They're the ones that I count. My success rate all the way through the season was 97.5%. And then in the last bit of the season, it dropped off because I started doing some experiments and some crazy things. So it dropped down to 95. If I was to subtract the experiments, I would have ended on around 98.5% success rate. And as I said, it's about 600. So that's some of them at the start of the season, same sort of grouping. And then the next photo was taken around a week or two ago. So these would have been grafted around November, and this next photo is from about a week ago. So worlds apart, absolutely worlds apart. So the stock Pereskiopsis is a tropical cactus, and it is probably the least cactus-looking cactus that there is. I'll show you what it looks like in a second. That's it there. So it's more shrub-like. It has leaves. This is them in winter, and they're terribly ugly in winter, but they don't get much better looking than that for the rest of the year anyways. So they do sort of grow like a bramble if you let them go. Mine never get too out of control. That's about as far away as I let them go. They have spines and they have glochids. So glochids are basically tiny little spines, and I liken them to shards of glass. They're painful, but you kind of get used to them after a while. Now, they rarely flower, if at all. I've never seen them flower. I've not seen pictures of their flowers, so this is sort of what you get. Now, for myself, it's a utility plant, so it represents little to no collection value. I grow it specifically for a purpose, and that is grafting. So I've not invested any time in its origin or natural habitat or anything like that. I've instead focused my time on getting it to grow to best suit the purpose that I have it for. And we'll cover off that a little bit later on. So the pros and cons, I'll start with the good side of things, and that is that it is exceptionally fast. There is nothing else that you can graft a seedling to that will grow as fast as Pereskiopsis. It will outperform 9.9 out of 10 times of any other stock you could think of. It's also extremely strong, and I find that strength has a direct transfer across into the scion. That transfer of strength I don't find always occurs with every stock that you might use. In the case of Pereskiopsis, the strength that it has transfers into the scion, and so you can have very, very strong, robust plants in a short amount of time. It's also incredibly easy to propagate, and the example that I would use, and this is not an exaggeration, you could break a piece off and literally throw it across your backyard, come back in a couple of weeks and it'll be growing. It's literally that easy. So that's always a plus when you're looking at grafting stock. It tolerates a wide variety of conditions, and I'd like to emphasise the word tolerate, because whilst it will tolerate a lot of conditions from drought through to being inundated with water, it'll actually grow in water, cold all the way through to steaming hot. In order for it to do what I want it to do, I need to keep it happy. So if you forget about it for a couple of months, it'll still survive, but for the purposes that I use it, I need to keep it happy. But it will tolerate a broad spectrum. The other thing, there's another picture of it. Excuse the poor picture. The other benefit that I find is the ability to graft tiny, tiny seedlings. So that's an example of about the size that I work with generally, the little seedling there. Now I don't have giant fingers, I think they're just regular size. So that gives you an idea. I work down to a little bit smaller than that, and I really can't think of any other stock that would be as receptive to a seedling. Also considering that when you're working with something that small, you don't have the option of applying pressure. So that's why I will always choose Pereskiopsis for super tiny ones, because there is not another viable option that I can think of. It is also, in my opinion, the best stock for seedlings. By far, it outperforms on every level, and it also has a very high reception rate as well. And what I mean by that is it will accept grafts very easily, and I haven't come across any scions that seem to dislike Pereskiopsis. It sort of just seems to pair well with everything. The final pro is a bridge between a pro and a con, and that is that it shoots or makes sort of new stems very easily. Now, if you're to cut Pereskiopsis, it has an automatic response to go into overdrive and start producing lots of shoots from the stem. Now that's a fantastic trait to exploit if you're trying to propagate it, but when you're grafting, you're also cutting the top off, so you're still activating that trigger. So it's a pro and a con depending on your perception. Onto the downside of it. So the number one thing is it is only a viable option when it is warm. It doesn't like the cold, so it's really only going to be worthwhile using when our weather is warm and when it is stable. It also splits scions incredibly easily. So this poor guy up here is an Astrophytum onzuka, and as you can see, it's that big gnarly split on the side. But this guy copped it double on both sides. So that strength that I mentioned a moment ago does have a downside, and that is that it can be too strong and it can split the scions. But that strength also has the added benefit of it not dying. Now, if that were to be on its own roots, with that level of damage, I would almost guarantee that plant would die. But because of the strength of the stock, it carries on. The other downside is excessive pupping. So up there at the moment is a gymnocalycium. It's a variegated plant, and as you can see, it is inundated and completely surrounded by pups. So it comes down to that sort of perception. It can be a good thing if you're wanting to propagate something and make more of it, but it can also be a hindrance if you are trying to grow up a specimen plant to size. There's a few more examples. That one there I think looks like handy, so that's why I included it. And I've got a couple of pictures now of some Areoses, and I find that the Areoses family in particular are most susceptible to the heavy pupping. Pretty much all of them will produce at least 2 or 3 pups when they're grafted. This is probably my least favourite when they do this, and that is they just become completely inundated. So it's the main head has been swallowed up, and then there's so many smaller ones, there's not a lot you can work with there. And there's another example there. The other downside is the glochids, which I mentioned earlier. I've come to accept them as part of life. And I accept the fact that I'm going to end up with them in my hands, my arms, my face, my legs, anywhere you can think of these things will get, no matter how careful you are. So that can be a downside. Now, the glochids don't have an irritant in them that I know of, but if you do have sensitive skin, I would recommend extreme caution. I've got skin like old leather, and even I can get annoyed, and my skin can get annoyed with them. I think it's just through sheer volume that it becomes a problem. Pro tip, if you end up with some stuck somewhere and you can't pull them out because you can't see them, I take my nail and just drag your nail where you think they are, snap the ends of them off, and as long as they're not getting caught on something, they won't hurt anymore. So that's, you're welcome. Now the other downside is that they're labour intensive. They don't have to be in terms of, they'll tolerate a lot, but if you're going to use something that has the capabilities that Pereskiopsis does, you might as well push it to the full extent. So you could probably take a more lax approach and not water as much, not fertilise as much, not take the offshoots off, and you'll still probably outperform all other stocks. But given what you can achieve in, that's probably 6 or 7 months, you might as well take full advantage of it. That's just another example. Alrighty, now, Pereskiopsis is generally viewed as a short-term stock. So a couple of years is usually how long you'll use it for. So the reason for that is that the growth rate works on sort of a tier basis. So in the first year or the first season, your growth will be through the roof. Almost daily, weekly, you'll notice the plants growing. In the second year, it drops down, and usually in the second year, the stock will drop all of its leaves. And then it just keeps dropping off thereafter, and then you end up just at this sort of pup stage for the last few years. So that little guy up there, that's a Lophophora, which I grafted in 2014, and the next photo was taken about, last week. That's the guy there. So it is more than capable of supporting a larger scion for a long period of time, but you're not going to get those explosive growth rates that you get in the first season. So I don't know if the photo does it justice, but that plant's actually about the size of a mandarin, not those huge Newton mandarins, you know, the normal nice ones. And there's just a little profile view. And every year I say I'm going to degraft it, and every year I don't. So, but there he is. So it is more than capable of supporting something long term. It is, however, traditionally viewed as a short-term stock. Now, if you remember the pictures that I showed at the start of the Pereskiopsis looking all ratty and ugly, that's how it can actually look, and that's how it does look when it's happy. It's nice, it's juicy, it's green, and my toes are in there for some reason. So it's quite a world apart from how it looks when it's unhappy. So I'll move on to how to grow it, and I won't dwell on this too much, and the reason for that is that it offers little to no cultivation difficulties at all. I've never had it attacked by any pests, any diseases, nothing. This stuff is bulletproof. In saying that, there are a few things you can do to keep it a little bit happier and grow it even faster. Soil mix, I find, does not make much of a difference. I've grown it in everything from straight sand all the way through until rocks, straight potting soil. No one of them had any overwhelming difference. The only thing I did notice, and this is a little curious, if you grow it in a high sand mix, the roots grow fantastically. There's no transfer to upstairs, so you don't get any payoff for that. But for whatever reason, when it's in sand, it makes fantastic root systems. The only recommendation that I would have in the mix that you're using is make sure that it holds onto some water, because it's a very, very thirsty plant when it's actively growing. The mix that I'm using at the moment is predominantly potting soil, and I use the El Cheapo potting soil. It's what I use for all of my plants. I don't buy the expensive one. A little bit of gravel. It's a 5 to 7 mil range if you're wondering. You could use scoria, quartz pebbles, whatever you got. Don't use anything expensive like pumice or zeolite. There's no point. I've got in a little bit of perlite and a little bit of vermiculite, and the last two are purely just for water retention purposes so that I don't have to water it quite so frequently. Moving on to the watering. During the growing season, when it's warm and the plant's happy, copious amounts of water. You will not drown Pereskiopsis. I've left it in buckets of water and for weeks on end, and it won't rot. Out of the few thousand plants of it that I've had over the years, I think I've maybe rotted a dozen. So you're not going to drown it, don't worry about that. In the off season, when it's cold, you drop back the water. You still need to give it water every couple of weeks, but you don't need to drown it quite as often. Fertiliser I feed when it's growing every 2 weeks. Blood and Bone, Thrive, pretty much whatever I've got on hand, as long as it's got a decent amount of nitrogen, because it is a leafy green plant. For light, part shade all the way through to full sun it will tolerate, provided that if it's in full sun it's kept well watered. The number one important thing I find for it is temperature. It doesn't like the cold. I've said that a couple of times, but it's pretty important because being tropical, if it gets too cold, it just gets miserable, and it doesn't matter what else you do, it's going to stay miserable. It loves the height of our summer when we get those really hot days on end. That's when it's happiest and when it's well watered. So its propagation is exclusively by the way of cuttings. As I mentioned at the start, it doesn't flower that I know of. I haven't seen it, and so I've never heard of anybody raising it from seed before. So it's always done by cuttings. Again, super easy. Break a piece off, throw it at the dirt, it will grow. For the case of general propagation, so you're trying to increase your numbers, you'll just cut a piece of stem and plant it directly into well-watered potting soil straight away. You don't callus the end off. You don't dip it. You don't need to dip it in hormone powder, gel, or anything like that at all. And it's a little strange if you're used to traditional cacti, and I might refer to them as, and that is we're usually making sure that the end of a cut surface is fully calloused and dried, and we might wait weeks or months for that to happen. And then you come across this guy and you're literally cutting it and planting it straight into freshly watered soil. It's a very strange feeling. So for general propagation, that's how you'll do it. The tips, which is what we'll graft onto, is a little bit more specific in what I'm looking for. And I'll go over that in just a second. Side note, leaves will not grow new plants. If you break a leaf off, yes, it will produce roots, but it won't produce a new plant. The leaf will just make roots, plump up, and it will just stay like that. So don't waste your time. I've tried that several times. You need a piece of the stem in order to produce a new plant. So for grafting, the propagation that I do, and this is part of my method, is I want to use the absolute freshest tips that I possibly can. And for me personally, I don't want them to be any more than 3 to 4 weeks old. And yes, it does grow that quickly if you keep it happy. So 2 main things: keep it warm and keep it wet. That will keep it happy. So these tips, as you can see, beautiful, juicy green. They're super young and will be very receptive to grafting. So you can really only achieve this in October is pretty early. November is usually when we'll kick things off, because that's when the temperature's where it needs to be at. I think having the tips like this is very important. My earlier attempts, I would just cut off whatever piece, and maybe I didn't water it properly 1 week or something like that, and my success rate was not where it should be, not where it is today. So I put a lot of emphasis on making sure that my tips are grown very, very fast. Sometimes I'll have a purple tinge, but not always. And so what I'll do is I'll go along, I'll cut the fresh tips, you twist off the bottom couple of leaves, plant them into freshly watered potting soil, and then put them into a plastic tub from Kmart or Bunnings. The opaque ones work the best. Stay away from the clear, they don't diffuse the light, so stick with the opaque ones. And in around 2 weeks, you'll have roots and they'll be ready to go. And what you'll find by putting them in the tub as opposed to leaving them out is that they will retain this juiciness and this lush growth. When they're this soft and juicy and lush, they're a lot more receptive to accepting a scion and accepting a graft. Leafy is best, but not essential. So you'll see that most of them there have a good amount of leaves, apart from maybe, this is handy, this one here. So you'll see the tip here is useless. I can't use that bit, so I'm probably going to cut about here, and by the time I do that, I'm going to have very few leaves left. But that's not going to be a problem because I'm going to get most of my growth in the first season anyways. That's when this stock is its most powerful. Now the next point, and this might ruffle a few feathers, depending if there's any Pereskiopsis grafters in the room, is what size does the stock need to be? Now I've seen this topic very hotly debated in forums and on chat groups and all sorts of things. And I'm going to say that the size of the stock does not matter. I know a lot of people will argue that it needs to be 8 inches, 10 inches, whatever it is. They'll argue that point. But the simple fact is a scion or a graft has a maximum rate that it can grow at. Now, if I can achieve that growth rate, which I do, with 2 inches or 3 inches of Pereskiopsis, why on earth would I leave the tip on the bush for another 2 or 3 weeks to get up those extra couple of inches for the same result? Knowing how fast it grows, I would much rather use those 2 to 3 weeks having the scion grow. You can only push it so far before it splits. So that's why I'll say I don't really care as to what length they are. The vast majority of mine are some fresh soldiers. I call my Pereskiopsis an army because that's what it's turned into, and these are the little soldiers. So here's another sort of family shot. And most of these, I actually had to get the tape measure out. I think most of them are around 4 inches. Between 3 and 5 inches is around where most of them fall. So hopefully that didn't ruffle too many feathers, but that's my experience, is that it doesn't matter. There is a little disclaimer that I do have to make about that point though, and that is, in the second year, when the leaves do drop off, if you have a shorter stock, it will not perform as well as something as a longer stock, for the simple fact that it doesn't have as much surface area on the stem to produce energy to photosynthesize. But again, considering that it is predominantly used only for 2 years, it doesn't really matter. It just depends on what your intentions are. If you're going to leave it on there for a long time, maybe leave the shoot on the Pereskiopsis for another week, 2 weeks, and get that extra length. But if, like most people, you're only using it for 2 years, it's not going to make any difference, because you'll have that in under a year and double that at the 2-year mark. Alrighty, so the tools that I use are up on the screen. There's 2 that's not, one of which I mentioned just a moment ago, being the opaque tubs, and then the other is paper towel, but I didn't really think you'd want to see a picture of paper towel. So number 1 is the isopropyl alcohol. I will not use anything else to wipe down surfaces, blades, tweezers or anything, and that is because it evaporates very easily and doesn't leave any residue. Windex, spray and wipe, all of those will leave some level of residue, which will have an impact on your success rate. Not to say you can't use other things, but in my experience, and to sort of get where I'm at, this is how I've done it. Big tweezers, which I'm sure nearly all of us would have. If not, get them from the pet shop. They're used for feeding reptiles and for taming Pereskiopsis. The last one there is a bit of an ugly example, but that is a scalpel. Early on, when I first started grafting, I used Stanley knife blades, I used razor blades, basically anything sharp that I could think of. And what I noticed was when I was cutting the seedlings, no matter how I did it, I was getting bruising. Now, if you've ever damaged a succulent or cactus, you know that watery look it gets under the skin? It's bruising. And I was finding that I was getting that a lot with the seedlings, and then of course the success rate was embarrassing. It was 0%. So then a little while ago I changed to a scalpel, and the beauty of a scalpel is that 1, it's incredibly sharp, sharper than a razor blade, and 2, the blades are very thin. So the thinner the blade, the less pressure is being exerted on the scion, and then that way you get a nice clean cut with minimal, if any, bruising. So you don't have to sweet talk a surgeon. You can actually just get those off eBay for literally a couple of dollars delivered. The blades are also very, very cheap. I'll use a blade for around 30 to 40 grafts, and then I'll change over. I don't use it any more than that. I'll use it in the rest of the collection. As you can see, that one's battered, but for grafting, not too long. Alrighty, so sorry for the terrible pictures. I usually work with video more than I work with photos, so I sort of had to go scrummaging around to find what I could. If you're looking at the seedling selection, this is an assortment, and this is a grafting session that I would have done last season. And one of these here is one of the Gymnocalycium that I showed with all of the pups. So when you're selecting the seedlings, firm, vibrant and healthy is ideal, but not a necessity. You can graft some rather sickly looking seedlings. I had to practice that at home, saying that is. You can graft some pretty sickly looking seedlings to Pereskiopsis and they will perk back up and they will take off. Of course, it will have an impact on your success rate, but it is entirely possible, and the success rate is good enough that it's not such a huge loss. It's actually worth doing. I don't recommend anything too big, and the reason for that, and I've got a picture example coming up, is that the vascular bundles, or the pipework of the cactus that you're trying to line up. On the Pereskiopsis, it's a ring that runs close to the edge of the stem, and the seedling, the vascular bundle runs down the centre. So when you're trying to line those two up, if you're using a seedling that's too big, it's going to hang over the edge of the Pereskiopsis, depending on how thick it is. So I recommend smaller ones. I also recommend grafting the smallest seedlings that you can possibly handle. They're going to be more fiddly and a lot more difficult initially to handle when you're cutting them, when you're placing them. But I find two things happen. One, I find that I have a higher success rate. And two, it's much easier to line up the vascular bundles with a very small seedling because it increases the target area. So you've got that band that you're trying to line it up against. The smaller the scion is, the easier it's going to be to line up. So short-term pain, long-term gain. All right. So the two rings there is probably an example that you may have seen before, and that is crossing the vascular bundles of two cacti. And this is how it looks in larger grafts that you might be doing. But in the case of seedling grafting, this is more of an accurate representation of what you're trying to achieve. The white line is the vascular bundle of the Pereskiopsis, and the pink dot, it's a lovely shade of pink I might add, is the seedling. When you are grafting, I have three main tips to work fast. One key point where you need to be fast, and that's after you've cut the seedling, is getting it onto the Pereskiopsis. Don't go off and make a cup of tea and then come back. Second one is to work clean, and that is cleaning in between each graft. I don't want the blade in between cutting the Pereskiopsis and the seedling, only in between each graft in its entirety. And the last one, and this is probably the most tricky one, is to work steady. Personally, I have shaky hands at the best of times, and after graft 50 or 60 it gets even worse. But try and steady your nerves, because you're doing fine work. I think a lot of us would probably get shaky, so a little bit of mind over matter. This pitch is terrible, but vascular bundle is here. As you can see, it runs around the outside of the Pereskiopsis, and then the middle of the seedling is in here, and that will line up across. So, and there's another example there. So vascular bundle is here, the pipework is here, and then the seedling is crossed over that. And that little guy there is actually the mandarin we saw earlier. So when you're actually grafting, what you'll do, you've got your tips. They've come out of the plastic tub. They've been in for 2 weeks. They're looking beautiful. You cut the top of the Pereskiopsis off, avoiding the absolute tip because it's far too thin. Now, if you've followed or you've grown the Pereskiopsis tips in the way that I do, another reason that I recommend growing them so fast is that the entire stem is usable. Because it's so young, you can use the entire thing. So if you mess up the first cut, you can cut again and again and again. And you can work all the way down till you've got nothing but a nub left. If you don't grow the Pereskiopsis fast, then you're only going to be able to use the youngest part, which is usually the top third. So that's another reason that I recommend growing it so quickly. So you've made that cut. You'll then cut the seedling at the widest part, which makes it easier to manage. And then you quickly from there grab the seedling and place it on in this sort of fashion here. And when I say quickly, when I was putting a grafting video together, I was editing it and I kept hearing this bang, bang, bang. What is that? And then I realised that what I was doing, after I cut the seedling, I was sending the scalpel flying because I was trying to pick up the seedling so quickly. It was almost like a grafting ninja. So that's how quick that I'm doing it. So I definitely shouldn't graft around small children or pets. So that goes back to the working fast part. The last tip that I have for the actual active grafting, and I do have a full video tutorial on my channel if you'd like to see it, zoomed in and everything. Once you put the seedling onto the Pereskiopsis, and I've watched many people graft, and a lot of people seem to do the same thing, is that they're very, very delicate. They take the seedling and just, like they're scared they're going to break it. I do things a little bit differently. I will actually push quite firmly onto the seedling, I push down and then a slight turn. There's three main things that will stop the scion and from the union from taking. Number one is sap, either from the Pereskiopsis or from the seedling. Number two is an air pocket, and so that firm pressure and twist will expel any excess liquid or air pockets and help that union take place. Because otherwise what will happen is you might have an air pocket or a little bit of sap. It forms a bubble and it stops the tissue from meeting, and so you think, oh, this is fantastic, my graft is taken. 2 weeks go by, no growth, 4 weeks, and then you push it and you realise the bottom of the scion sealed over. It never actually met. The last reason that it might not take is that you haven't got a level cut on both surfaces. Easier said than done, but if you apply a reasonable amount of pressure, and I mean quite firmly, even if the cuts aren't perfectly flat, there is still a chance that it will take. You will just end up with what I call a cliffhanger. So as you can see, he's just barely hanging on. And I end up with a few of these every year. And it's where the cut surfaces haven't met perfectly. They haven't met perfectly, so I haven't cut things properly. But with that pressure, it was enough. I'd rather have an ugly successful graft than a pretty unsuccessful one. So after each graft, what you'll then do is put them straight into the plastic tub and put the lid on immediately. I don't spray any water in the plastic tub. I don't put any bowls of water or anything like that at all. Just whatever moisture is in the pots that the shoots are in. And I do that after every single graft. So I'll graft, put it into the tub, put the lid on and keep going, keep going. Now the aftercare is something that I've been working on as part of my own grafting process for a few years now. So once they're all done, they're all in the nice opaque tub, you squish them on nice and firmly. The tub will stay in bright shade for 5 to 7 days. Make sure it does get some light, some sun, because the Pereskiopsis needs to kick on and support the scion. So it'll stay there for 5 to 7 days. At the end of that time, you'll crack the lid open just a little bit, then a little bit more the next day, and you'll do that over 3 or 4 days. Once they're acclimated, take them out and then put them into heavy shade for another week, and then let them rest there for another week. After that, they've been grafted now for 2 weeks. They can move in with the rest of the plants. You will find that most grafts, with the exception of a few that can be a little bit pedantic, will tolerate fairly extreme conditions considering their size. And it goes back to that strength transference from the stock. So what might blast a poor little baby asterias that's growing on its own roots will not phase a grafted one. So after that 2 weeks, they're going to hit the ground running, they're ready to go. And then that's it. So after that, you then basically just water and fertilise to maintain the growth rate that you're after. And that is how I graft. These are last season's, so not the season gone, the one just before, and they're all ready for their repot. So I repot in the second year because the soil's exhausted by that stage. There's one last section that I do have, if you'd like to hear about that, and that's about manipulating the growth rate for grafted plants. Do we have enough time? 5 minutes? Yeah. Cool. All right, easy done. So first and easiest way to manipulate the growth rate, and the reason that you might want to do that is to reduce the chance of splitting, which we've seen what can happen. Not a death sentence, but it's not pretty. So quite simply, reducing water until you achieve the growth rate that you're after, or increasing if you want to speed it up a little bit. In the first couple of months, they will grow and they will stretch quite well because the seedling skin is a lot softer than an adolescent or an adult cactus once it sort of takes on those characteristics. These ones here, this is adult skin, well, close to, it will split, but at that size, it's very hard to split them. So number one is with water. Second one is with food. Now remember, with fertiliser, you can always add it, but you can't take it back out, so be very, very careful. And then the last way, and it's not a method I'm a fan of, but it might suit some purposes, is remembering that when we graft, we're going to get lots of shoots. You can leave the shoots on, and that will dramatically slow the scion growth. Just keep in mind that Pereskiopsis favours its own. So if there's a shoot and there's a scion, it will give everything it's got to that shoot, and the scion will just sit there. Every single time, it always favours its own. So you can use that method if you wanted to grow something very slowly, but still, I guess the advantage of that would be that you'd have less chance of excessive papping, no chance of splitting, and it would retain a bit more of a natural growth and characteristic. But plants grafted on Pereskiopsis generally aren't very natural looking, but it's not for natural looks, it's all about speed. Thank you everyone. I hope you found it interesting. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Excuse me, will you go back to the start so I can photograph your site name?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Why don't you just tell them?
Where do you grow the other stocks? What part of town?
Where am I?
Cold.
Very cold.
So, what's your lowest tolerance of temperature for that other stock in winter?
Lowest
Tolerance, where they become unviable.
They'll survive it. That's not an issue. So they'll survive. I mean, we've had -2 because we're in a valley, so we always get a little bit colder than everywhere else.
Yeah.
-2, and everything's still alive. The viability more so extends to when you can actively graft onto it. So it will tolerate that cold.
Yeah.
It doesn't like it, but it will tolerate it. But in terms of when it's receptive to grafting, when it's warm and stable.
Yeah, I got that. I was looking at the survival rate of that for a cold winter. So
Oh.
they can hang in.
Yeah.
No,
I've lost 2 mother plants, but I left the greenhouse window open, so they were just getting blasted by the cold, yeah. But if you put them somewhere sheltered over winter, they'll survive. Yeah.
Excuse me, I know nothing about this. It's probably a dumb question.
No such thing.
You're grafting them on, but what happens to the bit you're growing? It looks ugly, so why would you?
Do you mean when there's too many?
You've got the big bit on the top and the stalk here.
Yes.
So you don't keep on growing. Look at you're talking about the last 2 years or something. I don't understand. that.
Sure. So what we would do at the 2-year mark is either degraft it or regraft. So degrafting would be to take it off, stop it being a lollipop, cut the stalk off, and then get it to grow on its own roots.
Oh, okay, that's right.
Yeah. So what we'd achieve in 2 years of grafting on Pereskiopsis could take 5 to 7 growing naturally.
Yeah.
If you regraft them, do you still use Pereskiopsis or another rootstock?
No, I would use another rootstock. So you can use Pereskiopsis to do what's called an impale graft, and that's when you would form a spear out of the Pereskiopsis and then you harpoon the scion onto it. It's not a method that I use. For me, Pereskiopsis is all about seedlings. I think there's much better options for larger scions, long-term stock. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that just kind of shows what you can do when you're rather keen on some particular little part of cactus and succulent. And I'm sure each and every one of us have our own little area that we think might do that rather well. So Corey has now challenged you to put that all down on the paper and inside a camera to come up here and let us all know. An excellent presentation, Corey.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Hopefully you will encourage some more of these people. I'm sure there'll be people grafting quite a deal later in the year, which is wonderful to see. We have some winners over there.